was Juan Villanueva. Peruvian typeface designer, lecturer and educator in living and working in New York City. Senior type designer at Monotype. And a while ago, he took TDC to task to be more inclusive and more broad. And I think, yeah, this talk and next talk is all about decolonization. Yeah, I don't know how to pronounce it, I can write it. And post-colonial times. So as a white Western man, it's weird. But I think it's a very, very important discussion to have. So please give it up for Juan Villanueva.
All right. Hello, everyone. Hi, my name is Juan Villanueva. I'm a senior type designer at Monotype, and I'm also an educator based in New York City. Thank you, Yves, for introducing me. I'm really honored and grateful to be here speaking at ATypI in Paris. My talk is titled Reclaiming Peruvian Typography, a Decolonial Read on Design History. This is a very personal and difficult talk to give because my very existence is the result of colonization. And I'm working through trying to understand my own identity and figuring out what decolonization means to me. So I want to set the stage with these two quotes. The first one is by Nina Pime. Nina is a Brazilian designer, curator, and educator, currently based in Switzerland. She's a co-founder of Futurist. In an interview with the design podcast, Scratching the Surface, she said that the idea that somehow design can be neutral, it's only possible in places like Switzerland. But in Brazil, this illusion is impossible. Everything is on fire all the time. So coming from Latin America and being exposed to European culture, I know exactly what she means. This facade of neutrality is a privilege and a tool of colonization that is perpetuated and reinforced through design, because everything is designed. And the second quote is by Jen Wang. She's a design generalist working with both publishing and technology, and also creating spaces that center designers of color. In an article that she wrote called Now You See Me, Helvetica, Modernism and the Status Quo of Design, she said that ignoring the social context that informs aesthetic choices and the political role of art and culture exemplifies a privilege of whiteness, a privilege that enables the white person as the voice of authority. So when you declare something as neutral and try to extricate it from context, when you remove the complexity, you are in fact enabling and perpetuating white supremacy. Neutrality is a privilege and a tool of colonization. There is nothing neutral about type and design. So let me give you some context about myself so you can understand where I'm coming from. So I was born in Lima, Peru. I speak Spanish and I have an accent. This is me as a kid on my first day of school. I've always been fascinated by this particular stone. This is called the 12th-angled stone located in Cusco. I love this stone because it's a prime example of Inca architecture. It shows how advanced and perfectionist they were, and it reminds me of how I approach type design, which is to be work really hard and try to always get a good fit. And this is how big the stones actually are. My dad is from the coast of Peru, in the south of Peru, in a city called Chincha. It's pretty close to the Nazca lines, and as a kid, we would go on trips to learn more about this marvel of the world. My mom is from the highlands, from the region of Apurimac, where the people are mainly indigenous citizens of Quechua descent. So my parents and my parents' families, they both migrated to Lima, the capital of Peru, in search of a different future, right? Work opportunities for themselves and for their children. And my parents met in Lima, and that is where I was born. I grew up in Lima surrounded by all kinds of letter forms, mainly handmade letter forms, and these are the letters that helped me navigate the city as a kid. As an adult now, looking at this, it brings a lot of memories, but as a type designer, also a lot of ideas for many typefaces that I would like to make. But then my family relocated to New Jersey in the United States, and everything changed, especially my relationship with typography. This was my full name where I live in Peru. And this is what happens. The word ñawi is the word Quechua. It means eye or sight. My mom's side of the family speaks Quechua, but because of colonization, I grew up in a society that to this day looks down upon their indigenous people, so the language was not passed down to me. And this was my name after we moved to the US. So I did not just lose a diacritic, I lost a lot more than that. But living in New Jersey also offered new opportunities for myself. I was able to attend Montclair State University, where I majored in graphic design, illustration, and animation. And then through a friend, I learned about this program called Type at Cooper in New York City. And at the time, it was the only place where one could study type design in the US. So luckily, I was able to get in. And after 2 years graduating from Type at Cooper, I was able to find a job at Monotype, where I've been very lucky to work with some of the most talented people in the world, some of whom I'm meeting for the first time here in this conference. Teaching has been really important in my development and understanding of who I am as a Peruvian type designer, trying to make sense of a world and an industry where my design history is not even a footnote, and conversations around context and culture are absent from type design education. And we cannot talk about decolonization without first talking about colonization. So let's talk about colonization. Aníbal Quijano is a Peruvian sociologist. He developed the concept of coloniality of power and wrote about it in regards to the history of Latin America. In his article, Coloniality of Power, Eurocentrism, and Latin America, he wrote that the idea of race, in its modern meaning, does not have a known history before the colonization of America. In America, the idea of race was a way of granting legitimacy to the relations of dominations imposed by the conquest. So in this way, Quijano is telling us that how race became a tool of colonization to dominate, exploit, execute, and rob indigenous peoples. Quijano continues saying that the fact is that from the very beginning of colonization of America, Europeans associated non-paid and non-wage labor with the dominated races because they were inferior races. And the vast genocide of the Indians in the first decade of colonization was not caused principally because of the violence of the conquest or the plagues that the conquistadors brought with them, but because so many American Indians were used as disposable manual labor and forced to work until death. And he wrote much more, but I just want to highlight these 3 points about colonization, which they expropriated the cultural discoveries of the colonized people, most apt for the development of capitalism and the profit of the European center. They repressed, as much as possible, the colonized forms of knowledge production, and they forced the colonized to learn the dominant culture in any way that would be useful to the reproduction of domination. And the effects of colonization are still present to this day. I see it all the time. My culture is undermined by white supremacist narratives, where they give aliens credit for the work my ancestors did. And this is what happens as history in the History Channel. Right? This is not history, this is fiction. My culture is not for your entertainment. What kind of education are people getting where they don't have the criticality to see that this is wrong? Here's a company from France appropriating my culture for profit. They have a statement that says they give 20% back to indigenous people to help. But don't forget, this is a business of cultural extraction and appropriation. If they really wanted to help, they go to the communities, the local government, and work with them to change things. They wouldn't put themselves in a position of power with the narrative of helping when they're actually exploiting. My culture is not for sale. Colonization is violence, colonization is erasure, and colonization is not over. If you're thinking perhaps of adding a line to your EULA about restricting usage cases of cultural appropriation, I think that's a good idea, but it's not going to solve the problem. Designers need to be aware and critical of their work. The examples that I showed are works of designers, art directors, project managers, etc., and no one, I guess, realized that they were doing was causing harm. So hopefully now that you understand a little bit of my context in terms of colonization, in terms of design, in terms of the history of Peru, we can start talking about decolonization. So what does this mean? Decolonization is an umbrella term. It means different things to different people, depending on their context. And that's why I had to tell you about my context first. Franz Fanon, Francophone, Afro-Caribbean, psychiatrist, political philosopher, Marxist from the French colony of Martinique, wrote a book called The Wretched of the Earth, which talked about the dehumanizing effects of colonization, as well as an approach to decolonization. In his chapter on violence, he wrote that decolonization never takes place unnoticed, for it influences the individuals and modifies them fundamentally. It transforms spectators crushed with their essentially underprivileged actors with the grandiose glare of history's floodlights upon them, brings natural rhythm into existence, introduced by new men and with a new language and a new humanity. Decolonization is the veritable creation of new men. So the effects of colonization are so deeply entrenched in one's mind, body, society, culture, power structures, that to decolonize yourself would be to be completely transformed in every single way and become a new person. So is it too late for us? I see decolonization as a long and painful process of learning about the effects of colonization and then having to forge my path forward with that knowledge. So I'm going to share some of the resources that have helped me understand what decolonization means to me, and then I hope that it's helpful for you as well. Bell Hooks and Paul Freire have been influential in shaping my pedagogy and leading a classroom that decenters whiteness and approaches the subjects we study with criticality and love. In 2020, Ahmed Ansari made a free online course on modernity and coloniality, and I can credit that course for lighting the fire on my education in decolonization. He made the theory more accessible, which really helped me wrap my head around concepts of modernity, coloniality, and decoloniality. The class audio recordings, PDFs, and readings are all up in his website, so you can check it out and go on that journey yourself. From top to bottom, we have Cheryl D. Miller, Maurice Cherry, and Mitzi Oku, whose work within the Black community have been very inspirational and models to follow for creating communities that center Black and BIPOC perspectives. Decolonization is not a metaphor. It's a really important writing by Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang, where they post that decolonization is about the return of the land to indigenous people. You can't have decolonization without returning the land, without giving up that power. Don't use decolonization as a blanket statement. Try to say what you mean and mean what you say. Ramon Tejada, a professor at RISD, has been a mentor of mine, and his approach to decolonization is about puncturing and making spaces. He's one of the people who helped me see my own indoctrination in design education, at least in the US. And going back to Ahmed Ansari, he pointed out in an online lecture that it's common for people entering decolonization to focus on the negative arguments and also have a solutionist approach, instead of perhaps trying to imagine the possibilities. For example, and this is one example that I came up with, instead of just having a one lecture from, let's say, a person of color in your mostly white European class curriculum, you have to go back to the drawing board. Reimagine your class, envision a curriculum that decenters whiteness, and then build towards that. And use that as a context for bringing lecturers that will add to that goal and not just be a token to maintain the illusion of diversity with the delusion of neutrality. Here's Nina Paim and Maya Aubert, again from Futurists, an online publication where feminism, design, and politics meet, and perhaps the only space where I've seen type, design, and politics overlap in a way that does not center whiteness. Trey Seals' Foundry Vocal Type is an example of a practice that not only centers BIPOC narratives, but also treats typefaces as forces of diversifying design and preserving culture. And the last resource, and perhaps the one I encourage everyone here to get or read if you haven't already, is Dory Tunstall's Decolonize and Design book. It'll give you a practical framework for doing this kind of work yourself. In an interview about decolonization, Dory said that the work of decolonization is the work of white people, because they are the ones who built the colonial structures. It's 2023, we're an international conference about type. There's only 2 talks with decolonization in the title. So in both talks have been given by people of color. So, where are all the white type people in the conversation about decolonization? You are all part of this too. We are all part of this. But so it's clear, I'm not asking you to come to the stage and talk about decolonization. I'm advocating for learning about this so that you can actually be an ally. So my approach to decolonization is to reclaim my own culture and make it visible in a way to expand the canon and counter the white patriarchal Eurocentric narrative in design. I started teaching in 2016, and like my ID says, I feel like a visitor. Not having seen myself reflected in the curriculum that I've been taught made me feel like I didn't exist in an industry that I was clearly part of. So I started thinking, asking questions about, myself, and there was no answers in the books that I was given. So I had to research my own history, and I really wanted to learn what happened in Peru in terms of type and design. So at the end of 2021, Ramon Tejada, whom I mentioned earlier in this presentation, invited me to be part of this course that he was putting together about the incomplete history of Latin design, Latin American graphic design. And I said yes. So I pitched him the class on typography and language in Peru, where I would look at the visual and written communication from pre-Columbian times until the early 21st century. So thinking about myself back in college, I think this is the class that I would have loved taking and would have a profound effect on me in the way I approach design. I organized my research around significant events in the history of Peru, and themes started to emerge. These are the chapters of the class that roughly covers 5,000 years of history. And I'm going to jump around a little bit on the first two chapters to give you a sense of our history, but also highly recommend getting this course through the BIPOC Design History courses and supporting them. So I want to start with this chapter on indigenous writing systems and visual communication. By stating that there were advanced civilizations in Peru before the conquest, before Latin was the dominant script, and before European colonization. So in this chapter, I'm going to show you 3 indigenous writing systems, the artifacts that historians, researchers, archaeologists have studied in an attempt to understand how knowledge is stored and passed down through generations. Ruth Shadi is the founder and director of the archaeological project in Caral, where her picture was taken. Caral is the earliest Peruvian civilization that we know, dating back approximately 5,000 years. And on that site, they found a quipu, which according to Ruth is the oldest quipu, and it shows that this society also had a system of writing which would continue down the ages until the Inca Empire. This is what a quipu looks like. This is not the oldest quipu, but this quipu is from the Inca era. And it's basically a court-based record-keeping system, and the messages are encoded in the various kinds of knots, colors, fabrics, lengths, directions. There are many civilizations between Caral and the Incas, and each of them had their own kind of quipu. There was an online exhibit at the Lima Museum of Art in Peru, which you can still find on Google, and they even have a podcast if you're interested. Another form of communication dates back to the Moche civilization, which is around 1 to 800 AD. On these vessels, you can see a series of beans in a pattern that goes around the vessel, and they were used for storage, solving, and funerary offerings. These images come from the Larco Museum by Rafael Larco Hoyle in Lima. He collected and studied pottery and the artifacts of the Mexicans and other ancient civilizations, and he published 2 papers about the topic of bean writing. They're not really long. It's really interesting to see how he compares the beans with the Mayan glyphs in one of his papers. Andean civilizations are also known for their textiles and very intricate patterns. The tunics that you're seeing here are called unku, and the geometric patterns are called tocapus, which are believed to be another form of writing. These kinds of decorations with tocapus are associated with elite lineage, rank, and profession. And although hundreds of tocapus have been found, researchers still haven't been able to crack the code. Research by Dr. Gail Silverman, who traveled and interviewed indigenous people of Cusco, suggests that this is a kind of pictographic writing. So now that you know a little bit about 3 indigenous writing systems, let's look at what these civilizations were speaking. According to the research by Rodolfo Sarrón Palomino, during the Inca Empire, people spoke Puquina, Aymara, and Quechua. Puquina is extinct, but Quechua and Aymara are still around, are among the most spoken languages, according to a census from 2007. And a quick primer on Quechua, it was also known as Runa Simi, Runa meaning people, Simi meaning language. So Quechua is literally the people's language. And it was a spoken language until the Spaniards came. This illustration by Juan Villanueva shows the conquistadors kneeling before Atahualpa. Shortly after that, they would betray him and execute him. And I want to frame this next section through the lens of calligraphy, because although the Latin alphabet was forced upon indigenous people, and spoken languages like Quechua and Aymara were forced to adopt an alphabet, indigenous people used those new skills to record their stories and tell them in their own words. That is the case of the indigenous chronicler Felipe Huamán de Ayala, who wrote and illustrated a 1,189-page chronicle. And in this document, he documented and denounced the abuses and the horror that the indigenous people were suffering under the colonial government. His plan was to send this to the Spanish king so that he would end these abuses. So for this reason, I think as a designer, Huamampoma borrowed the typographic conventions of the time. It's 1615, almost 100 years after the betrayal of Pizarro, the murder of the Inca Atahualpa. The conquest is brutally happening right at that time. And although there are already printers in Peru, printing is really expensive. So he relied on his calligraphic skills and illustration skills. His chronicle is very unique because it is very, very comprehensive. Not only in writing, but also the detailed illustration of the Incas and customs and stories. And this helps in understanding how some of these indigenous writing systems were used. So to wrap up Huamampoma's work, he illustrates both the execution of Atahualpa on the left and Tupac Amaru on the right. Tupac Amaru was the last Inca, and he led a series of revolts that made him a symbol of protest and rebellion throughout Peru's history. A lot of what we know about that period comes from this chronicle. However, Huamampoma was not neutral. His agenda is very clear. He wants to stop the genocide of the indigenous people, and in doing so, he mixed some reality with fiction. His work is available online through the Digital Research Center at the Royal Library in Copenhagen, Denmark. And this is just the beginning of the class, but there's much more there, so I invite you to check it out. But I want to remind you of this one question as you learn about different kinds of histories. Through what lens are you looking at it? Having awareness can enable you to challenge the status quo. Here are some examples. Seeing that there was nothing on the subject and having been a key player in the birth of graphic design as a profession that we know today, Octavio Santa Cruz gave himself the task of writing the only book on Peruvian graphic design available, starting from the 1960s, which is when he started as a design apprentice. His first-person account and interviews with other Peruvian designers of the time are as close to history as we can get. This book was published in 2019, right before the pandemic. That's Octavio at the bottom right. You can see some of his typographic work and layouts. I go a little bit more in depth during my class. But I'm really grateful for Octavio for recording this, such an important part of Peruvian history. And on my part, I made my class bibliography and resources available for free for anyone who's interested in diving deeper at perutype.com. Octavio's book is also free online. You can find it there. And I've also created other resources for students as well as designers that are trying to get into type. But I want to share more about a project that I started with my friend and co-director Lin Yoon, putting together our years of experience teaching and creating spaces for learning in community. We started our own online school called Type Electives with the mission of shaping the future of type. And we aim to form a more inclusive and equitable future in type and design by increasing accessibility to specialized education and creating a thoughtful space to shape the discourse around type as culture and industry. We launched with 7 online classes focused on letter forms, including type design, lettering, and creative technology. And one class in particular really embodied the mission of our school. This class was called Provoking Type, led by Chesa Garbett. Provoking Type was a 5-week course that invited participants to take a critical and decolonial lens of type and their role in history, culture, technology, power, structures, identity, to explore and reimagine the narratives, contexts, and futures of type. Participants were guided by Chesa and our guest lecturers, who included Lauren Williams, Ragnar Ramanathan, Silas Monroe, and our class showcase is currently on our YouTube channel, so you can check it out. This summer so far, we've launched 3 classes. 2 of them are our most accessible type design classes for beginners, and 1 on graffiti concepts for type people. And since creating a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive future in type is at the core of our mission, we have scholarships for all of our classes. In the last section, I just want to share some questions you might already be familiar with, but I think are a good reminder for you to think about how far we've come and how much we still have left to do in terms of understanding and challenging the status quo. In 2020, Alphabet's a global network of women in type and letters published this article called It's Time to Act. This was a call to action for the type industry, published in the wake of George Floyd's brutal murder by the Minneapolis police, and ignited a series of protests around the world asking for social justice against racism and discrimination. And in this article, they list 4 very important points, and I'm just going to read them. And all I ask is for you to listen and to think about whether or not you've seen any kind of change happen. So the first point is, we need to actively include more BIPOC in our events, conferences, and communities. As a sponsor, did you use your privilege to insist on a diverse lineup of speakers? If not, why not? And as a speaker, did you get invited to present at a conference and find that the lineup of speakers was particularly pale? Did this bother you? Did you get in touch with the organizers and voice the concern? Did you step away from the presentation as an act of solidarity if your input on this matter was not appreciated? Point number 2, we need to stop using the term non-Latin. It is exclusionary and loaded with bias. It only recenters the attention to whether or not Latin. Point number 3, we need to diversify educators, our students in our curriculums. Did we try to connect such students with a specialized expert and make sure that these experts were appropriately compensated and credited for their time and expertise? And point number 4, we need to discontinue the practice of designing for scripts we did not grow up reading and writing for custom design projects. This last point caused a lot of controversy because it had to do with money, people's livelihood, and obviously power. So whether you agree or disagree is not the point, really. What I think it's important is not to react, but to listen and try to understand where this perspective is coming from. If you try to understand your own context, check your own privilege, try to understand how colonization has affected you, then perhaps you'll be able to see that this call to action is not telling you what to do, it's someone telling you what they need from you. And it's up to you to figure out your own path forward with that. So I want to raise one question for everyone in the audience, in person and online. How are you using your privilege and power to dismantle white supremacy in the many areas that you're part of? Your team, your founder, your practice, your organization, your research, the people you work with, the classroom, your lectures, your feedback, the people you invite to talk. There are no simple answers to this. So I'm going to leave you with a quote by James Baldwin that I think cuts through all the performative noise that we're used to seeing from people and also from organizations. I can't believe what you say because I see what you do. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, Juan. We have scant minutes for questions and answers. Anybody want to have a go at it?
Hi, Juan. My name is Corina Cotorobay from ATypI Foundry. Well, I'm white, semi-white, you might think, but I'm also a product of colonization. I was born in Moldova, and we were colonized by Russians. My grandparents lived in 3 countries without moving anywhere. And this aspect exists here in Europe. So what I'm trying to say, this is a long discussion. And we can, of course, say somebody is white, somebody is yellow, somebody is red. But I'm afraid that this phenomena exists everywhere. And it's only now that maybe, just maybe, we're starting speaking out. It wasn't encouraged. There wasn't even an ear for this. So if you'd ask, how do we work at ATypI? Frankly, we try to work with people who think like us. Fred Smyers, he's of Indonesian origin. He's an Indonesian Dutch, but his parents and grandparents were first generations of political refugees. So in Europe, yes, we are white, but not quite. So let's think about it, let's speak about it, but it's not black and white in the end. Thank you.
Somebody else? Okay, if there are no other questions, I would like to say a little thing. My term as a board member from ATypI is up in September. I would really appreciate it if somebody took my place that doesn't look like me. So if you feel the urge to participate in this whole conversation, please think about submitting your proposal for being a board member, so at least I get replaced by somebody and make this a more diverse culture. Thank you so much, Juan. We'll move to the next speaker.